2 decades ago, a wave of factory closures across the United States revealed the consequences of a shifting global economy. The first China shock came swiftly and quietly, transforming China into the world's manufacturing hub and leaving a trail of lost jobs and weakened industries in its wake. Today, the next shock is already forming, but this one is more ambitious and potentially more destabilizing. It no longer centers on toys or textiles. It targets the very technologies that will shape the future: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, and advanced energy. China is no longer catching up. It is leading in areas that matter most. And while policymakers debate past trade wars, the strategic contest for global technological leadership is already underway. This article explores how the second China shock is unfolding, what it means for the global economic and security landscape, and what governments must do to prepare for a far more complex era of competition. Between 1999 and 2007, China's industrial rise was largely about volume. The country shifted hundreds of millions of rural workers into urban factories. It became the dominant exporter of low-cost goods, from clothing and footwear to electronics and furniture. This transformation caused lasting disruptions in manufacturing economies elsewhere, most notably in the United States, where entire towns were economically dislocated. The first China shock was rooted in labor arbitrage. China offered low wages, simple infrastructure, and the scale to serve global retailers. But over time, wages rose and the cost advantage narrowed. Countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, and Bangladesh began to compete in the same segments, eroding China's dominance in commodity manufacturing. This created a need for a new national strategy, and China has been executing it with determination. The second China shock is not about competing on price. It is about competing on ideas, patents, platforms, and standards. China's focus has shifted to sectors where leadership yields strategic advantage: in national security, global influence, and economic self-sufficiency. These sectors include semiconductors, aerospace, electric vehicles, clean energy technologies, quantum computing, robotics, and synthetic biology. Mastery in these fields delivers more than jobs. It offers leverage in global affairs. China's new strategy reflects a different model of economic coordination, one that blends entrepreneurial competition with centralized strategic direction. In the 1990s and early 2000s, China relied on partnerships with multinational firms to climb the manufacturing ladder. Today, it is using a more state-aligned ecosystem. Private companies still play a central role, but they are often funded, guided, or backed by local and provincial governments pursuing national objectives. Municipalities now compete to build advanced industrial bases, often with public venture funds, R&D subsidies, and long-term infrastructure planning. The city of Hefei offers a striking example. Once a relatively obscure regional capital, it became a leader in electric vehicles and battery production by identifying opportunities, taking investment risks, and partnering with technology firms. In fewer than 6 years, Hefei moved into the country's industrial top tier. China has repeated this pattern across sectors. BYD dominates the electric vehicle space. CATL is the largest global supplier of lithium-ion batteries. DJI leads in drone manufacturing. LONGi is a central player in solar wafer production. Each of these firms began as small startups and grew rapidly in a system designed to reward aggressive innovation and technological success. This system is not built on slogans. It is built on execution, incentives, and measurable outcomes. Mayors and governors are promoted not just for economic growth, but increasingly for technological achievement in designated sectors. Where Western governments often struggle to pick winners, China has institutionalized a framework to identify and scale emerging champions. China's ambitions are not confined to its domestic market. It is exporting its technologies, standards, and infrastructure to emerging regions: Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and increasingly Eastern Europe. These efforts are not simply commercial. They shape digital ecosystems, telecom infrastructure, energy transitions, and even defense arrangements. Through tools like the Digital Silk Road, Chinese firms are building the technological spine of new economies, with implications for data governance, cybersecurity, and sovereignty. China is also asserting itself in standard-setting bodies, aiming to define the global rules for 5G, artificial intelligence, and green energy. The country's lead in frontier technologies is widening. According to recent international assessments, China now leads the world in 57 of 64 key emerging technologies, an inversion of its position 2 decades ago, when the United States led in most of them. The United States response, but is it enough? In response to China's industrial ascent, U.S. policy has often leaned on a familiar tool: tariffs. These measures can offer short-term relief to specific industries, but they are not a comprehensive strategy. In some cases, they harm allies and limit access to the very technologies needed to stay competitive. Tariffs are not a substitute for national strategy. They do not build domestic capacity, fund research, or attract talent. Nor do they address the structural reasons for technological erosion: underinvestment in R&D, fragmented industrial policy, and volatile political cycles. A more effective response requires coordination with like-minded economies. The United States shares deep trade and research relationships with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and Australia. These partners face similar challenges from China's strategic industries. Coordinated policies, such as joint investment in clean tech, common export controls, and shared standard setting, would be more effective than isolated measures. To address the second China shock, four strategic pillars should shape the response. 1. Align with commercial allies. The most urgent shift is diplomatic. The United States must treat its commercial partners as strategic assets, not as rivals. Tariffs on European EVs or Asian semiconductors undermine the unity required to face a common competitor. Instead, the United States should lead in forming coalitions that pool investments, synchronize trade tools, and harmonize technology regulations. Multinational collaboration can reduce duplication, expand market access, and deter unfair practices more effectively than unilateral actions. Tariffs, when used, should be part of coordinated campaigns, not random acts of retaliation. A coalition of countries imposing calibrated tariffs on Chinese overcapacity would send a far stronger signal than isolated trade measures. 2. Invite competition on U.S. soil with guardrails. Inviting Chinese firms to manufacture in the United States may sound counterintuitive, but it can have benefits. It introduces competition, raises local standards, and generates employment. The catfish effect, a concept Chinese policymakers often cite, describes how the presence of a strong foreign competitor forces local players to improve or perish. Just as Tesla spurred innovation in China's EV market, Chinese firms can drive domestic players to accelerate. However, this openness must be paired with strict safeguards. Strategic industries such as communications infrastructure or advanced semiconductors may require special review. Investments in those areas must be screened through security and transparency protocols. But the default should not be blanket exclusion. Instead, it should be competitive inclusion under conditions that protect national interests. 3. Rebuild the U.S. innovation system. The United States once led the world in public investment in science and technology. From the Manhattan Project to the Apollo program, government-led innovation shaped entire eras. But public R&D as a share of GDP has declined sharply since the 1960s. Reversing this trend requires a new institutional framework. The country needs a strategic investment agency, insulated from political churn, to fund emerging sectors with high risk and high reward. Think of it as a Federal Reserve for technology. Programs such as the CHIPS and Science Act are a start. But the funding must be sustained, the goals clarified, and the delivery accelerated. Crucially, success cannot be measured only in patents or prototypes, but in commercialized products, scaled firms, and global competitiveness. This innovation push must also extend to education, infrastructure, and talent. It means investing in STEM programs, modernizing ports and grids, and welcoming global scientists and engineers who can help build the next generation of industries. 4. Support workers through the transition. The human cost of the first China shock remains etched into many communities. Entire regions saw their economic identity vanish, replaced by lower-wage work or long-term unemployment. These scarring effects fueled political discontent and weakened faith in global economic integration. If the second shock is to be managed more responsibly, support systems for displaced workers must be expanded and modernized. Programs like trade adjustment assistance should be reinstated, scaled, and better targeted. Career retraining, community college grants, and wage insurance are not luxuries, they are economic stabilizers. Without them, technological change will continue to be viewed as a threat rather than an opportunity. The second China shock is not a distant threat. It is already underway, reshaping supply chains, redefining competition, and redrawing spheres of influence. China has moved beyond catching up. It is now actively setting the pace. It is investing, standardizing, building alliances, and challenging the West in the industries that matter most for the future. The question is not whether this competition exists, but how prepared the United States and its allies are to meet it. The next chapter of global economic leadership will be written not in trade deficits or tariff schedules, but in labs, factories, and classrooms. Winning this race does not require copying China's system. It requires learning from it, and responding with confidence, coordination, and ambition. While the first China shock caught much of the world off guard, the second is unfolding in plain sight. This time there is no excuse to be unprepared.